She felt him before she saw him. The pull in her sternum, low and insistent, like something buried had recognized its match through stone and distance, and all the months she had spent trying to forget what recognition felt like. The threshold stone stood at the edge of the Veyrath Peaks, and Mara Solwyn stood with her back against it, watching the figure descend the switchback trail below. He was still a quarter-mile out. She could already smell wood smoke and pine, and the particular scent beneath both that had no name she was willing to give it. Her hands did not shake. She had trained herself past shaking. The stone at her back was the oldest structure in the Aldenmore territory, older than the pack, older than the mating rites, older than the law Callum Veyrath had used 11 months ago to send her past it in the dark, under orders she had not been told were coming. She had not knelt then. She did not intend to kneel now. She was the moon's chosen. The mark on her left palm proved it. A crescent scar that had appeared at her first shift, white against brown skin, pulsing faintly with silver light when the full moon sat overhead. The pack had called it an honor. Then, when honoring her became inconvenient, they had called it something else entirely. Callum reached the base of the switchback and stopped. Even at this distance, she could read the set of his shoulders. The deliberate stillness he used when his body was already making a decision he had not cleared with his mind. She had catalogued that stillness over 3 years. She had loved it once. "Mara," he called up. His voice carried the same way it always had, low and clean, the kind that moved through wind rather than against it. She did not move from the stone. "You walked 4 days through the peaks," she said. "That means either you've got something important to say or you're desperate. Which is it?" He started climbing. She watched him come and kept her breathing even and thought about everything that had happened since the last time she stood in the same space as Callum Veyrath, who had been her mate, who had been her betrayer, who had signed her exile order in front of 47 witnesses and told her the pack had voted and the vote was final. She had not cried then. She had not cried since. What she had done was survive and learn and become something the Aldenmore pack did not have a name for yet. He was 12 feet from her when she raised one hand. That's close enough. He stopped. His face was older than 11 months should have made it. There were lines at his eyes she did not remember, and the jaw she had memorized down to the particular tension of its muscle held a weariness that looked bone deep rather than earned. Good, some part of her thought. Then the rest of her quieted that part, because satisfaction was not why she was here. "There's been a curse placed on the hearthstone," he said. "We can't put it out, and we can't leave it. 3 of our elders are caught in the binding. I know what you need," Mara said. "I knew the moment I felt the curse move through the ley line, 12 days ago. I came here because I chose to, not because you sent for me." His mouth closed. He looked at her with something she could not immediately name, something older than wanting and quieter than grief. Then he said, "Tell me what you need me to do." It was not the sentence she had expected. She stood against the threshold stone and let the wind off the peaks move through her hair, and she thought about the year she had spent learning what it meant to be chosen by something that did not require a pack's permission to be real. She had been 26 when she met Callum Veyrath, and she had not been looking for anything. Her mother's people were Solwyns, a line old enough that the pack histories mentioned them in the margins, lunar-blooded women who carried their gifts quietly and their losses loudly, who had served the Aldenmore territory as healers and ley line readers for 4 generations without holding a single position of authority within the pack structure. Mara had grown up understanding that the work mattered even when the credit did not follow. She had been 19 at her first shift, late by pack standards, which produced its own particular whisper network, and the crescent had appeared on her palm before she was fully returned to human form, white and permanent and unmistakably lunar. The elder Senna had pressed both hands over it and made a sound like weeping before she composed herself and said, "Moon's chosen. There has not been one since your great-grandmother's time." The mark meant she could read ley lines with her hands alone, could sense curse work before it set, could speak to the old ones, the spirits the Veyrath peaks held in their granite like amber holds insects, and receive answers that were not riddles. The pack treated her with new deference and the particular anxiety of people who are not sure what they've gotten. She had spent the next 7 years being useful in ways they could not quite categorize, and she had been, mostly, content. Then Callum Veyrath came back from 3 years with the Northern Alliance packs, and everything rearranged itself around a different center of gravity. She had first seen him at the spring gather. Mud on his boots, nothing on his face that was performing anything, a large hand curled around a mug he had not brought to his mouth in the 20 minutes she'd spent at the periphery of his orbit before she caught herself doing it. He was the Alpha's brother, which she had known academically. What she had not known was that his scent would hit her bloodstream like a key in a lock she had not known she was carrying, and that when he finally looked across the fire and found her looking back, the crescent on her palm would pulse once. Not in warning, but in something that felt terribly like welcome. 3 days later, he had found her at the Eastern Spring, where she went every morning to read the ley lines before the rest of the pack woke up. He had not asked permission to sit beside her. He had brought 2 cups and set one by her knee, and then he had been quiet in a way that did not require filling, and she had thought, "This is either going to be extraordinary or it is going to cost me everything." It turned out to be both. They fell into each other the way ley lines find their channels, not with dramatic fracture, but with the patient certainty of water finding the lowest point. He asked her questions that assumed she had thought about things before he arrived at them. She argued with his read of the Northern Alliance politics, and he listened rather than performed listening, which she had not experienced often. The mate bond declared itself between them 6 weeks after that first fire, on a hillside above the Aldenmoor fields in the blue hour before sunrise, when he had taken her scarred hand between both of his and pressed his mouth to the crescent, and she had felt the bond open in her chest like a second heartbeat sinking to her own. "I know what this means," he had said against her palm. "I know it's not small." "No," she had agreed, "it's not." For 18 months, it had been the realest thing in her life. The trouble did not begin with Callum. That was the thing she had spent 11 months revising in her understanding, untangling the knot of it, finding where the first thread had actually been pulled. The trouble began with Aldrich Veyrath, who was Callum's older brother and the pack's alpha, and with the thing Aldrich feared. Aldrich feared the ley lines. Not in the way one fears fire, in the way one fears a river that has changed course and cannot be predicted. He was a territorial alpha in the old style, physical, protective, dominant, in the specific mode of a man who had earned his authority through challenge and consolidation, and the ley lines operated by a logic he could not control or confirm. Mara's ability to read them was useful when it served the pack's boundaries, and inconvenient when it suggested the boundaries themselves were the problem. Twice in the second year, she had read the lines and told Aldrich that the territory's eastern edge ran against a fault in the old compact, that the Veyrath claim on the lower peaks was built on a ley line junction the old pack had marked wrong in the original settlement. Twice, Aldrich had thanked her politely and done nothing. The third time she brought it to the full council because the fault was deepening and she could feel it in both hands when she pressed them to the earth, and 3 of the outlying families' wards were already starting to degrade. Elder Senna had backed her. The council had listened and then voted to table the matter until an outside reader could confirm her assessment. Aldrich had smiled at her across the council table with his teeth and said nothing. A month later, the whispers started. Not loud ones, the kind that move underground, that you hear in pauses, in the particular quality of a room when you walk into it. The Moon's Chosen was causing division. The Moon's Chosen was ambitious. The Moon's Chosen was using her bond with the Alpha's brother to position herself above her station. Mara had gone to Callum with the whispers, in the 3rd month after they began, and he had pressed his forehead to hers and said, "They're afraid of things they can't hold. I'll speak to Aldrich." She did not know then what that conversation contained. She did not know that Aldrich had shown Callum a document, one she later learned existed, later learned was fabricated, later confirmed through the Peak's old ones was a council record from 40 years prior that had been selectively altered. A document that claimed a Moon's Chosen, who formed a mate bond, was capable of drawing the ley line's power through that bond without the Chosen's knowledge or consent. That the bond itself could become a conduit that drained the mate's lifespan into the Chosen's gifts. Old magic, old fear, the kind of fear that requires very little evidence if the soil is already seeded with anxiety about what a woman with a mark on her hand might become. She did not know any of this until much later. What she knew was that Callum changed. Not all at once, that was the cruelest part of it. He was still tender with her in private. He still brought her the second cup. He still pressed his mouth to the crescent on her palm when he thought she was asleep. But he stopped coming to her when the ley lines needed reading. He stopped mentioning her assessment to the council. He began, in the smallest ways first, to not be in the rooms where her name was being questioned. She told herself she was misreading it. She told herself the bond was clear and strong, and she could feel him every time she pressed her awareness toward their connection. Feel his specific warmth, his particular steadiness. She told herself that was proof. The Hearthstone ceremony was held on the winter solstice, as it had been for as long as the pack had existed. Every mated pair renewed their vows before the stone. Every unmatched wolf offered what they carried to the pack's collective fire. Mara had prepared something to say, had written it and rewritten it because she believed in precision, because the ley lines had taught her that intention stated clearly arrived more cleanly than intention vaguely offered. She had stood at the hearthstone with Callum's hand in hers, and Aldrich had stepped forward with a scroll, and Callum had not turned to look at her. "Mara Solwyn," Aldrich had said, "the council, by unanimous vote, invokes the right of territorial exile for threat to pack integrity." He had read the charge in its formal language: disruption of pack hierarchy, suspected manipulation of ley line authority for personal consolidation, and, at the bottom of the scroll, one line she had not anticipated: bond manipulation requiring review. Effective immediately. She will pass the threshold stone before dawn. 47 wolves had stood in that hall, and not one voice rose. Callum's hand had been warm in hers. She had felt his pulse through their joined skin, not racing, not spiking into protest. Steady, regulated, the hand of a man who had already made his peace with what was coming. She had looked at him. He had met her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then looked away. She had not screamed. She had not wept. She had pressed the crescent on her palm flat against her thigh so no one could watch it dim, released his hand, and walked out of the Hearthstone hall with her back straight and her chin level, and the only sound she made in 47 people's presence was her own footsteps. The cold on the other side of the threshold stone hit her like a physical blow. She had her coat, her healer's pack, and the clothes on her back. She had 12 hours until dawn, which Aldrich had specified, presumably to be certain she used them. She stood outside the boundary marker in the dark and felt the mate bond stretched between her sternum and something still warm inside the hull, still present, still unreasonably real, and she made herself a single promise. She was not coming back for any reason that was not her own. Then she turned and walked into the Veyrath Peaks. The Old Ones found her on the third day. She had expected the peaks to be hostile. The air was cold, the ley lines in this deep territory ran hot and strange, pulsing with a frequency she had to consciously adjust her reading to catch. The Old Ones were the spirits the pack had named, but never communicated with directly. Geological presences, slow and enormous, the kind of consciousness that counted time in centuries and had very little interest in the anxieties of individual wolves. She had studied them from texts. She had not expected the first one to simply appear beside her while she knelt at a stream and say, in a voice that felt like granite pressing against the inside of her skull, moon-marked, exiled. Yes, she had said. Both. Good, it had said. The marked ones must always be exiled before they can be shown the full account. She had learned, over the following weeks and then months, that this was not metaphor. The Old Ones held memory, the way stone holds pressure, compressed, precise, unavoidable at geological depth. They had been witnesses to every ley line fault the pack had ever built wrong, every compact violation, every corruption of the old agreements that held the territory's supernatural integrity together. They showed her things in the manner of deep truth, not narrative, not vision, but sudden, total, physical comprehension, a knowing that arrived in her bones before her mind could formulate a question. The Aldenmore Pack's Eastern Compact violation was worse than she had read from the surface. The fault had been running for 40 years, and beneath it was something older, a ritual binding that the founding pack had placed in the junction stone, a binding that required a Moon's Chosen's acknowledgement to remain stable. No Moon's Chosen had touched it since her great-grandmother, and in the intervening years it had been fraying. The 3 elders now caught in the curse Callum had described were not caught by accident. The junction stone had finally split, and the binding's collapse was pulling the nearest souls with established ley line connection into a holding pattern, a kind of supernatural stasis that would become permanent without intervention. The Old Ones had been trying to tell her this for 2 years. She had read pieces of it and brought them to the council and been tabled. She was not going to be tabled again. Over the 11 months of her exile, she had learned to read the deepest ley lines without placing her hands on the earth at all. The crescent on her palm had developed a second function she had not known it contained, a capacity to transmit rather than only receive, to speak correction into a line that had been running wrong. The Old Ones called this the full account of the mark, the thing Moon's Chosen were not typically shown until they had survived solitude long enough to stop using the gift for the pack's approval. She had practiced on small faults first, a creek bed whose lay had been bent by the original territorial survey, a mountain spring whose water had tasted of old compact violation for a generation. She set each one right and felt the mark on her palm strengthen with each correction, until the crescent was no longer just white against her skin, but silver in direct light, pulsing with something that had moved past personal gift into something more like authority. She had also spent 11 months deciding what to do about Callum Veyrath. Not with sentiment, with the same precision she applied to the ley lines. She had mapped the bond between them the way she mapped fault lines, running her awareness along it, noting where it was solid and where it had been stressed. The bond was real. She had not invented it, and she could not dissolve it through anger, which she had tried. What she had done was stop letting it make decisions for her. The bond was a fact. What she did with the fact was still hers to choose. She had learned through the old ones, and through one conversation with a Peaks recluse named Darren, who had been the last Moon's Chosen's apprentice, 60 years prior, that the document Aldrich had shown Callum was fabricated. Not misread, not exaggerated, constructed. There was no historical record of a mate bond draining a Moon's Chosen's male partner. The fear was old, yes, but it had been authored for specific use, and Aldrich had authored it for this one. She held this knowledge with both hands and thought about what it meant for Callum. It meant he had been lied to. It meant he had believed the lie. It also meant he had chosen to believe it when believing it required him to do nothing at the hearthstone while 47 wolves watched and his mate's exile was read aloud. He had been afraid. He had been deceived. He had been, in the most technical reading, a victim of his brother's manipulation. None of that returned the warmth of his hand to hers, and she was not going to pretend it did. But she also knew, by the 12th day after feeling the curse move through the ley line, that she was the only one who could set the junction stone right, that the 3 elders in stasis were real people with families, that Aldenmore territory's structural integrity depended on the compact being restored, and that she was not willing to let people suffer for what Aldrich Veyrath had done, even if letting them suffer would have been the easier version of refusal. She was not going to fix it for him, she was going to fix it for herself, and for the elders, and for the old ones who had spent 40 years watching a crack deepen. When Callum had climbed the last of the switchback trail and stood 10 feet below where she rested against the threshold stone and asked her what she needed him to do, she had let the question sit between them for a long moment before she answered. "I need access to the junction stone," she said. "I need the council out of the hall when I work, because their presence creates interference, and I won't have Aldrich in the room for this. And I need your word, not the Pack's, not the council's, yours, that when it's done, you'll bring what you know about the document in front of the full council on record." He had stood in the wind off the peaks, and something moved through his face that she watched with a healer's attention and a scorned woman's distance, trying to read it clearly rather than through the mesh of what she had wanted it to mean, once. He said, "You know about the document." "I know everything," she said. "The old ones have deep memory. 11 months is a long time." His hands were at his sides. She could feel the mate bond between them, doing something she recognized, that pull, specific to him, that lived in her sternum and had never stopped, regardless of her instructions to it. She kept her posture against the stone and did not move toward him. She did not need to move toward him. He needed to stand in what he had done. "I believed it," he said. "That's not an excuse. I'm telling you what happened. I was afraid of losing you, and I let that fear be used against me and against you, and I have spent 11 months knowing that." "Yes," she said, "you have." She paused. "And that matters. But it doesn't fix what the Pack saw. It doesn't fix the 47 people who stood in that hall. It doesn't fix what the elders are inside now, while we're standing here." He came up the last of the incline and stopped 2 feet from her. The wind shifted, and she caught his scent fully. Wood smoke and pine, and that unnamed thing underneath, and the crescent on her palm pulsed once. Silver, unmistakable. She felt his breath change. She felt him register the silver light where the white mark used to be, the weight of what 11 months had made of her. "You've grown into it," he said quietly. "I've grown into myself," she said. "Those aren't the same thing." His eyes dropped to her palm, then came back up to her face. He was close enough that she could see the exact lines she had catalogued earlier, the ones age or grief or both had etched there, and she felt the bond do what the bond did regardless of her stated intentions, which was to make the distance between them feel like a physical substance she was pressing against rather than empty air. She had fought that feeling for 11 months. She was not going to perform not feeling it now. She reached up and placed her palm, crescent outward, flat against the center of his chest. She felt him go still, the specific stillness she had always catalogued, except now, it was not about an unclean decision, but about something arriving that he had not let himself hope for. She felt his heartbeat through her palm, and she felt the crescent's silver light deepen, and she felt, in the ley line language the old ones had taught her, the bond between them in its full articulation, solid in its core, stressed at the place where the exile had stretched it, but not broken, not even close to broken. The bond was lunar in its nature, the old ones had told her. It did not break under weight. It recorded weight. "I'm not forgiving Aldrich," she said, "and I'm not returning to Aldenmore on the Pack's terms." "I know," he said. He covered her hand with his, large and warm, and familiar in the specific way of something she had tried very deliberately to forget and had failed, and pressed it more firmly against his chest. "I don't want you to. I want you to come back on yours." She tilted her face up to his, and he was close enough that when he exhaled, she felt it, and she felt the bond between them sing the particular note it made when they were in full proximity, a vibration she had only words for in ley line language, not pack language, not common speech. She said, against his mouth, not quite touching, "Then prove it, in front of the council. Everything, Aldrich's document, the fabrication, all of it, on record, before I touch that junction stone." "Yes," he said, without hesitating. She closed the last distance then. His mouth against hers was familiar and entirely changed, and the mate bond between them did not roar or surge. It settled, the way a ley line settles when the course has been correctly redirected, with a rightness that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with truth. She felt his arms come around her back, and she let the cold wind off the peaks move around both of them, and she pressed the silver crescent against his heartbeat and let herself feel, for the first time in 11 months, what it was like to stop pressing against the thing that had always known him. She pulled back before she wanted to. "That was important. I mean it about the council," she said. "Mara," his voice was rough, "I've been rehearsing that testimony for 6 months. I was just waiting to find you." "You knew where I was," she said. "Yes." He met her eyes directly. "You were where you needed to be. I wasn't going to interrupt that with what I needed." She studied him. She thought about the man who had not turned to look at her at the hearthstone, and the man who had climbed 4 days through the peaks and tried to understand whether they were the same person in different chapters or different people she was mapping onto one face. The bond told her something she did not fully translate into words yet. She filed it. "Come on," she said. "Walk me through what you've prepared." They came down from the peaks on the 2nd day. She could have moved faster alone, but she chose not to, not because she needed his company, but because the walk gave them time to construct the framework of what was coming. She told him what the old ones had shown her. He told her what he had found in Aldrich's study in the 3rd month after her exile, when his certainty about the document had begun to crack and he had started looking. He had found the fabrication evidence in Aldrich's own handwriting. A draft of the false council record, corrected twice, the second correction more anxious than the first. He had kept it. He had been waiting, he said again, to find her. She told him about the junction stone and the nature of the work required. She told him about Darren, the old apprentice, and what the full account of the moon's mark meant in practice. She told him about the 3 elders in stasis and exactly what would happen to them if the junction stone was not corrected before the next lunar cycle. She had 21 days, and she had come with 12 of them spent. She was not hurried, but she was not casual either. He listened with the quality of attention she had loved about him in the first weeks, not performing reception, actually receiving. She watched him and tried to feel the difference between wanting to trust him because she loved him and trusting him because he had given her reason. The line between those things was important. She was working on it. They reached the Aldenmore boundary on the third day of travel. The threshold stone was behind them, and before them, the pack's edge markers ran in their familiar pattern through the tree line. She stopped at the boundary and felt the ley line pass under her feet, felt its disrupted current, the shudder deep in it where the junction stone split was propagating outward. "Before I cross," she said, "I want to see the document, the original draft, not a description of it." He reached into his inner coat pocket and produced 3 folded pages, creased with months of carrying. She took them and read them in the gray morning light at the Aldenmore boundary, standing outside the territory she had been exiled from, and she felt cold precision move through her as she confirmed what the old ones had shown her. Aldrich's corrections in the margin, the places where the fabricated legal language had been inserted over original text, the date falsified, the authority signatures forged, all of it, in his handwriting. She folded the pages and put them in her own coat. "These go on record." "Agreed," Callum said. She crossed the boundary. Aldenmore's territory in winter was muted, the scrub and stone holding their cold, the ley line's disrupted hum audible to her now with a clarity she had not had before exile, the crescent on her palm pulsing steadily in response to proximity with the junction stone's distress. She felt the pack's awareness of her return before she saw any of them. The bond network, the web of connection that ran between all territorial wolves, registered her crossing, and she felt it ripple outward. Aldrich met them at the inner tree line with 6 of his lieutenants. She had expected this. He was a broad man with a stillness different from his brother's, the stillness of a dam, not of water, and he looked at her with the precise flatness of someone who has already calculated outcomes and committed to one. "The exile stands," he said. "Whatever brought you back." "The exile was issued without legal ground," she said. "I have the evidence here." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The right of territorial exile requires a genuine, documented threat confirmed by 2 lunar witnesses. The documentation you presented to the council was fabricated by you, and your handwriting is on the draft. You forged the authority signatures. That makes every action taken under the exile order legally void. One of the lieutenants shifted. Aldrich's jaw tightened by a fraction. "Beyond that," she continued, "you have 3 elders in ley line stasis in your Hearthstone Hall. The junction stone that serves the Eastern Compact has split. You have 21 days before the stasis becomes permanent, and I am the only Moons chosen within 3 territories. You may choose to honor your fabricated exile, or you may step aside and let me do the work. Those are your options." Aldrich looked at Callum. Something moved between the brothers. Not communication, but the recognition of a point past negotiation. And then Aldrich stepped aside. The Hearthstone Hall held the particular stillness of a room waiting for something it could not name. The 3 elders stood at the stone's base, or rather, appeared to stand, their forms slightly translucent, their breathing shallow and arrested at a rhythm of about 6 breaths per minute, their awareness suspended in the ley line frequency where the junction stone's split had locked them. Elder Senna was among them. She had backed Mara's assessment in council, twice. Mara stood at the threshold of the hall and felt a quality of grief she chose not to examine in front of 43 assembled wolves and pressed it down with the same muscle she'd been using for 11 months. Callum stood to one side. He had spoken to the gathered pack before she entered the hall, had read from his prepared testimony the evidence of Aldrich's fabrication, producing the draft pages from her coat at her signal, walking the counsel through the corrections in the margin and the forged signatures and the falsified date. He had done it in the precise, quiet manner of someone who had rehearsed it long enough for the rehearsal to become grief rather than performance. When he was done, Elder Voss, the most senior remaining council member not in stasis, had sat for a full minute in silence and then said that the exile order was formally voided and the record would be corrected. Aldrich had not been present for this. He had, Mara noted, removed himself from the territory shortly after she entered. She did not know where he had gone, and she did not find, when she examined herself, that she particularly needed to. She crossed to the hearthstone and knelt at the junction stone beneath it, the original founding stone, black granite, cracked now in a diagonal fracture that wept a faint luminescence she could see with her marked eye. She placed both hands on it, crescent palm down, and felt the full account of the fault move into her from 40 years of accumulated drift. She did not flinch. She let it move through her, and when it had fully arrived, she began the work the old ones had shown her, the correction that moved not through force, but through acknowledgement, through the moon mark taking responsibility for the compact as its proper custodian, and stating the true line, the true boundary, the true agreement, clearly enough for the stone to record it. The work took 3 hours. She was aware, at the edges of her consciousness, of the assembled wolves, of Callum's steady presence at her left periphery, of the hall's silence deepening from held breath into something more like witnessing. She was aware of the crescent on her palm, moving from silver into a light that was difficult to look at directly. She felt its warmth from the inside, felt it transmit down into the stone, felt the fracture's resistance, and then the fracture's yielding, line by compressed line, 40 years of drift reversing in the grammar of the old compact's original intention. When the junction stone sealed, the sound it made was not a crack but a sigh, geological, definitive. The 3 elders exhaled simultaneously, and their translucence resolved back into full presence, and Elder Senna put her hands to her own face and stood blinking in the hearthstone hall as if rediscovering that the world extended past the stone. Mara sat back on her heels. She was tired in the specific way of work done at full depth, not empty but settled, her hands in her lap, the crescent now a steady silver white that matched the moon visible through the hall's high window. She stayed on the floor for a moment because she chose to, because her legs needed a moment, and there was no one present whose judgment about that fact she cared about. Then Callum was beside her on the floor, not presenting her with a hand up, just there, kneeling next to her on the Hearthstone Hall's stone floor in front of the entire pack. She looked at him. "Are you going to be all right?" he asked. "Just that. No performance in it." "Yes," she said. "Give me a minute." He gave her the minute. He did not fill it or explain his presence in it. He just remained. That was the moment. Not the kiss at the threshold stone, not the testimony, not the junction stone's sealing, when she made her actual decision about Callum Veyrath. It was not a dramatic decision. It did not overturn the 11 months or recategorize the Hearthstone Hall's darkness or erase the specific quality of his pulse beneath her hand when the exile was read. Those things remained, and they were part of the account, weight recorded, as the old ones would say. But here was a man kneeling on a stone floor in front of 43 witnesses, not to make a gesture, not to perform redemption, but because she might need another 60 seconds and he wanted to be in the same place she was. That was a different kind of knowing. She took his hand and stood up. The Pack Council met that evening in the hall, and Elder Voss formally recognized the exile order's nullification, entered Callum's testimony into the record alongside the draft documents, and issued a formal statement requesting Mara Solwin's return to the territory in the capacity of Moon's Chosen, under the Pack's full recognition, not as a position she had been given, but as an office the Mark itself carried, which the Pack was formally acknowledging rather than conferring. The distinction had been Mara's. She had spent 2 hours with Voss before the session, making sure the language of the recognition reflected exactly what she meant, which was that the Moon's Chosen served the compact and the ley lines and the lunar agreement, and not the Pack's preference about when and how that service was convenient. Voss had written it down as she said it. She had read it back and approved it. She stayed that night in the room she had grown up in. Her mother's family kept the healer's house near the Eastern Spring, and her cousin had maintained it with the particular stubborn loyalty of someone who did not agree with the exile but had not had the power to stop it. The reunion with her cousin, Petra, was 15 minutes of held breath and held hands and not many words, which was the Solwin style and suited her precisely. Callum found her at the Eastern Spring in the morning. She had expected him to. She was kneeling at the water's edge with both hands in the cold current, reading the ley line as it now ran. Clean and corrected, the junction stone's healing extending outward through the territory's network in the slow propagation of something finally set right. She felt him before she heard him, the mate bond warm and present in her sternum, and she did not stand up or turn around, just said, "The line reads clean all the way to the eastern boundary. It'll take another lunar cycle to fully integrate, but it's stable." He sat on the bank above her. "I know," he said. "I could feel it in the territory when I woke up, like something the whole pack had been holding was finally put down." She nodded. She kept her hands in the current. "I'm not going to ask you to decide anything yet," he said. "Good." She pulled her hands from the water and dried them on her coat. The crescent glowed faintly silver in the morning light, warm rather than urgent, working temperature, the old ones called it, the mark in its steady state rather than crisis function. She turned and looked up at him on the bank. "I made you a promise at the threshold stone. I kept it. Now you've made me one, and you kept it." She paused. "That's 2. I'm interested in a longer account." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does that look like?" "It looks like what it looked like at the beginning," she said. "Except this time, I know what the stone underneath it is made of, and I know what mine is made of. And neither of us is guessing about the other's capacity for fear." He came down the bank and sat beside her at the water's edge, close enough that their shoulders touched, the bond between them doing the thing it did, the steady, low warmth of proximity. She let herself feel it without qualification. The water ran past them, corrected and clean, and the morning light off the eastern peaks came down in long bars through the tree line, and the crescent on her palm pulsed once, evenly, in something that had long since stopped being a warning and had settled, as she herself had settled, into the authority of its own nature. She had not knelt at the hearthstone. She had knelt at the junction stone, because that was the work, and the work was hers. She had not returned because they called her back. She had returned because she chose the territory, chose the elders, chose the compact's integrity, and chose, with the same precision she applied to everything that mattered, to give the man beside her the space to prove that the account between them was worth continuing. She did not forgive Aldrich Veyrath. She did not intend to. He had used fear as a scalpel, and her exile as its edge, and the pack would carry the record of that for as long as the council's ledger held its pages. What happened to him now was the territory's reckoning, not hers, and she put it down with the same deliberateness with which she had put down the 40 years of ley line fault, not because it was nothing, but because the account was accurately recorded and she had more important work to do with the years ahead of her. Callum turned his face into her hair. She felt his exhale, long, unguarded, the breath of a man who has been holding something since before the frost came down, and she leaned, in the smallest degree, into the warmth of him. The mate bond sang the note she had no common words for, and the eastern spring ran clean, and the moon's light in the crescent on her left palm was steady and silver, and entirely her own. That was enough. That was, in the precise language of what she had learned in 11 months of stone and solitude, and the deep memory of old ones, the full account. She had been the moon's chosen before anyone recognized it, she would remain it after anyone stopped caring, and she would choose, going forward, only the bonds that bore that same quality of truth. She had never been asked to kneel. She had been commanded to. The difference was everything, and she carried it now in her posture and her palm and her deliberate, unrushed presence beside the man who had spent a year learning what it meant that she hadn't.